Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Enlightenment Workshop. It's a real pleasure to welcome you. I can't see you, but I know there are lots of people listening in, and we've been very excited this term by the number of people who've been joining us for these events. So this afternoon is another event where we're going to collectively review some important contributions to the Enlightenment. And today we're looking at two books, both by Oxford colleagues as it happens. The Lettres inédites of Marie-Antoinette, edited by Catriona Seth, and philosophical writings of Frederick the Great, just published at the end of last year by Avi Lifschitz. So the format's going to be as it was in previous weeks, where we'll begin with two discussants, Kelsey, Rubin-Detlev and Tim Blanning. They'll each speak and present their thoughts about these two books, and then we'll move on to the authors, and then there'll be lots of time for questions afterwards. Please can I remind you that put your questions in the Q&A, and please don't wait to the end to write in your questions, otherwise I will get very nervous that there won't be any. So write your questions as they occur to you. I'll have them on my screen, and then I'll come back to you when we get to the questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Kelsey Rubin-Detlev. Kelsey did her doctoral work in Oxford on 18th century Russian, and specifically on Catherine the Great. And she's now assistant professor in the Islamic department at the University of Southern California. Her current research projects include writing an intellectual biography of Catherine the Great, and I know that she's also interested in studying epistolary culture in Russia from, it's a pretty good spread this, from Ivan the Terrible to the 20th century. She recently published a book which is very relevant to what we're doing today, which is the Selected Letters of Catherine the Great, another example of royal writing, which she translated and edited with Andrew Kahn. And she's also just published in 2019 a book based on her thesis, The Epistolary Art of Catherine the Great, which published by the monograph series at the Voltaire Foundation. And it's just won a prize for the best first book. So that's very good news. Kelsey, I'm delighted to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like, first of all, to thank Avi and Nicholas again for inviting me to contribute to today's discussion. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to Catriona, Avi, and Angela Scholar for producing these two highly readable volumes. These two books present very different types of texts penned by thoroughly dissimilar individuals. And so they really illuminate in vastly different ways the phenomenon of the writing royal in 18th century Europe. But what I think unifies the two is precisely the sense that we gain of what writing could do for an 18th century royal individual, and of what these writings can do for us as 21st century readers. In his introduction, Avi moves us past the paradigm of image making and self-fashioning for thinking about the writings of Enlightenment monarchs. Instead, he situates the role of writing within Frederick's larger vision of government. By putting his texts in the public sphere, Avi argues, Frederick sought feedback from public opinion, which he considered to be the only legitimate check on his absolute power. And this is a key contribution, not least because the assertion holds for other Enlightenment sovereigns as well. In Russia, Catherine the Great did much the same thing when she published her nakaz, or instruction, to the legislative commission she summoned in 1767. Her primary aim was not so much to get a full law code out of the commission as to generate Russia's first ever public discussion of Enlightenment ideas about government, and to learn from her subjects' responses to her text. Like Catherine as well, Frederick was highly sensitive to the possibilities of different literary forms, and so tried his hand at a remarkable array of genres in pursuit of a variety of aims, political, intellectual, and personal. And Avi's selection gives us a diverse sampling of those literary forms and what Frederick was trying to achieve through them. And in this regard, what to my mind stands out is the extent to which Frederick consistently chooses literary forms that place him in dialogue. So if we think of the Enlightenment as a big conversation about improving the human condition in this life, Frederick's philosophical writings show the king seeking to participate in this conversation in all its different modalities and degrees of publicity. So like Catherine the Great, and unlike, say, Gustav III of Sweden or Joseph II of Austria, Frederick didn't go touring around Europe. So although sometimes his intellectual interlocutors were certainly willing to come to him in Berlin, much of the time, his writings were his primary means of making himself an intellectual presence across the continent. And the importance for him of being part of this dialogue for its own sake really comes through in the literary forms he adopts. His major political tract, the Anti-Machiavel, is a chapter-by-chapter argument with Machiavelli that's looking, to the past for that dialogue. He's likewise in dialogue with the Baron d'Holbach in his reviews of the Système de la Nature and the Essai sur les Préjugés, even if that dialogue is pretty vicious at times. The dissertation on the innocence of errors of the mind that opens the collection was, as Avi points out, a reaction to Voltaire's Éléments de la philosophie de Newton, but it also imitates in its form Fontenelle's Entretien sur la pluralité des mondes. So it's a sort of pseudo-epistolary relation of a friendly philosophical conversation that took place on a leisurely stroll out of doors. Sent to Voltaire, but never published in Frederick's lifetime, this dissertation anticipates the pleasure in philosophical dialogue that we see in, for example, Frederick's friendly epistle to Marshall Keith on the mortality of the soul. The volume doesn't include any letters, and I think that many of Frederick's letters might certainly fit the bill as philosophical writings, but Frederick's correspondence with Voltaire is very much present, since Avi's introduction and apparatus trace very effectively how Voltaire was Frederick's implied interlocutor throughout many of these writings. A final related purpose of writing that we see is Frederick's dialogue with posterity. He shared with many other Enlightenment writers the notion that future generations would be the ultimate tribunal to judge his achievements. So when he became the historian of his own reign, he explicitly addressed himself to those who would read his history after his death. So he leaves his history of my age unpublished while preparing it for discussion in the public sphere of the future. So overall, despite Frederick's somewhat flat and blunt style across all genres, which Angela Scholar has done an admirable job of rendering enjoyable to read in English, we get in this volume a picture of a sovereign whose sensitivity to his audiences and to literary form make him a versatile participant in Enlightenment exchange in all its modes. By contrast, in her correspondence, Marie-Antoinette proves oblivious to the literary possibilities of the epistolary form. And in this, as in so many other respects, Marie-Antoinette differs markedly from figures like Frederick and Catherine the Great, who throughout their careers viewed correspondence as a political, cultural, and personal tool and produced literary masterpieces in the genre. Nevertheless, as Catriona highlights, in these letters to the Austrian ambassador in Paris, the Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, we follow the French queen's discovery of the letter's potential. While the young Dauphine unwillingly scribbled whatever was required of her, as queen, she increasingly found her voice as she tried to involve herself in political affairs. And finally, during the Revolution, letter writing became Marie-Antoinette's lifeline, her primary or one of her major means of attempting to orchestrate an escape from the captivity in which she and her family found themselves. And at that point, the manipulation of epistolary form, although not really in a literary sense, became crucial to her survival. As she pointed out in a letter of August 1791, she relied on her correspondent's ability to distinguish between her style in her genuine letters and the manner she was forced to adopt in the missives she was required to pen by the revolutionary government. I think there's a curious similarity between Marie-Antoinette and her mother, Maria Theresa, in how they both came into their own as letter writers late in life and in connection with their roles as mothers. Maria Theresa wrote prolifically in the last 2 decades of her life, when she corresponded very regularly with her grown-up children to manage their political lives as representatives of the Habsburg dynasty. Marie-Antoinette was, of course, never able to correspond in the same way with her children, but not only did the birth of a Dauphin solidify Marie-Antoinette's position at court, and therefore her her ability to become involved in politics. But it also, as Catriona suggests, changed her attitudes. During the revolution especially, she was seeking above all to defend the future throne of her surviving son, not least by letter. Catriona's introduction wears its erudition lightly, but the immense amount of research that went into producing this edition comes through very clearly, especially in the extensive headnotes that precede each of the letters. They illuminate for us the tangled webs of surveillance, gossip, and political wrangling that surround each of these often quite brief and cryptic messages. So Catriona shows how here again, writings helped a royal individual to manage much broader conversations than first meet the eye. The fact that every word she said or wrote to Merci was likely to be reported back to her mother, Maria Theresa, was only the tip of the iceberg. In her notes to Merci, Marie-Antoinette asked him to explain bits of gossip she'd heard, to guide political conversations she was planning to have, or even to help her to write letters to other people, including her own brother. And throughout, whereas Frederick sought dialogue and exchange through his philosophical writings, Marie-Antoinette seems to be dragged into conversations she didn't want to have, but she uses her letters to try and cope with them. Catriona's volume urges us as scholars to think about how we work with and publish letters. As Catriona points out, any editor who claims to publish a complete correspondence is making quite an audacious claim. As we know, correspondences are by definition incomplete. Their open-endedness during the lifetime of the letter writer, the necessary geographical dispersion of the letters, their destruction by writers, readers, and the ravages of time, and the difficulty of deciding what is and is not a letter, trouble any enterprise of editing or analyzing a correspondence as a coherent whole. Catriona tells us the story, not just of how Marie-Antoinette chose to destroy many of her papers at key moments of the revolution, while other documents were preserved carefully by Merci and other supporters, but also of how the corpus was enlarged by 19th century forgeries. And Catriona's choice to print the apocryphal texts after the real letters challenges the reader to see if they've learned to recognize Marie-Antoinette's genuine style. I think it's also significant that Catriona includes only Marie-Antoinette's letters without, say, the surviving messages from Merci to Marie-Antoinette. Evelyne Levert, in her large 2005 volume of Marie-Antoinette's correspondence, opts for the opposite approach, although she omits about half of Marie-Antoinette's letters to Merci, which Catriona is here publishing. Levert includes letters exchanged between Merci and Maria Theresa, so letters that are neither addressed to nor written by Marie-Antoinette. And so one might even say that the effect in Levert's volume is to drown out Marie-Antoinette's voice yet again with the words of the people who surrounded her. Instead, Catriona's volume is an invitation to cut through a few centuries of mythologizing and return to the historical record itself with all its ambiguities, uncertainties, and gaps. Despite all their differences, these two collections both demonstrate beautifully how the writings of 18th century royals can still speak to us today. Like Richie Robertson's and Antoine Litsy's books, which were discussed at the last two sessions of this workshop, these two volumes aim to bring the 18th century to audiences beyond the scholarly community. And both editors have done a fabulous job of balancing scholarly accuracy with accessibility for a broad audience. And as someone who's also translated and edited the writings of an Enlightenment monarch for a general audience, I'd like to ask both Avi and Catriona about the genesis and evolution of their projects. Whom exactly do we envision as the audience for these writings, and what do we hope this audience will learn from reading them? For me, it was quite striking to sit down here in the US shortly after the storming of the Capitol building and read Frederick the Great's reflections on the nature and knowability of truth. It's not that I want to idealize, of course, the Enlightenment as a period when leaders thought seriously about the epistemological foundations of their approach to governance. We all know very well how many blind spots Frederick and his and his colleagues had. And along those lines, I'd be really curious to hear from Avi a bit more about the implications of Frederick's skepticism for his general philosophical outlook and his approach to governance. At the same time, when we're thinking about bringing Enlightenment texts to a broad audience, juxtaposing Frederick's endorsement of the right to be wrong in pursuit of the truth with today's age of alternative facts and post-truth might not be a bad place to start. Frederick's philosophical writings and Marie-Antoinette's letters are great examples of what Antoine Lilti spoke about 2 weeks ago. Enlightenment texts bring us face to face with our own contradictions, even as they plunge us into a completely other intellectual and political world. Thank you.
Kelsey, thank you very much. That was a wonderful overview of the two books, which seem to begin with quite different, but actually you've shown how there are parallels as well as differences. We're now going to pass straight on to the next discussant, who is Tim Blanning, who's joining us from Cambridge, and who has already won the prize for the best backdrop of the panel. Tim, I think he'll be visible in a minute, probably. Tim is Emeritus Professor at Cambridge and held the chair of Modern European History in Cambridge from 1992. He's written very widely on European history and culture. And I won't list all his monographs, there are an enormous number, but among the best known, most discussed, include The Culture of Power and the Power of Culture, published by the OUP, and a Penguin volume, The Pursuit of Glory, Europe 1648 to 1815. There are many books, several books on the French Revolution, but also you've written, Tim, on a number of Enlightenment monarchs, 2 books, I think, on Joseph II. Recently, a Penguin on George I, whom we describe as the lucky king. And what's especially relevant to today's discussion, you published with Penguin in 2015, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, which has a fantastic cover. Unfortunately, I don't have it to hand. And your Life of Frederick won the British Academy Medal in 2016. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. Yeah, the cover, I'm not sure which one you're referring to. There are 2.
There are 2. The bust, there's a bust of Frederick.
Oh yes, right, okay. That's the rather grim version that Simon Winder of Penguin wanted in England. But the Americans and the Germans, for the German translation, wanted something altogether much more playful and post-modern, which actually I prefer. But never mind. Anyway, many thanks for those kind introductory words. And you're right, yes, well, I'm very old now, and one thing about ages, you sort of pick up quite a lot of information along the way, and you drop some too. And along the way, I have, you're quite right, I one little book on Joseph II, just lectures really as a research fellow, which I'm ashamed of, and then a much more substantial, not very long, but quite a substantial book on Joseph II. So this is by way of introduction, saying that I've come across the Arnett editions of the correspondence of the Habsburgs, including crucially the correspondence between Maria Theresia and Marie-Antoinette, about which I'll have a little bit to say in a moment. But I want to start by saying to Catriona that this is a simply fabulous edition. I don't think I've ever had in my hand an edition which is so meticulous and so scholarly. Every dot is, every T is crossed and every I is dotted. I'll get that right in a moment. It's a simply fabulous piece of work. It must have taken an enormous amount of labor, but it's worth it. If there ever were a definitive edition of anything to do with Marie-Antoinette, and golly, that's a minefield, then this is the one. Just terrific. Thank you very much. And no doubt, well, it would be nice to have it translated, wouldn't it? Well, that's probably not going to happen much these days. So what struck me was that it's Marie-Antoinette personally, and the book in general picks up speed as it goes along. I mean, there are only, I think, 15 letters for the 1770s, and some of them are very short. I mean, just a couple of lines. But even them, of course, you've anchored the context there with what is a sort of mini essay before each of them, which is extremely helpful. And then the closer we get to the revolutionary crisis in the late 1780s, and more especially after the after they've been taken back, after the royal family's been brought back to Paris, and her situation becomes more and more desperate, it becomes more and more interesting, and she herself becomes very much more interested. You can see, I think it's the point which Kelsey's just made already, that she kind of grows, you know. I mean, she's using these letters as a means of, perhaps you might even use the word therapy. And I'm going to come to Frederick in a moment, but I would say that for Frederick, I mean, this huge amount of stuff he wrote. I mean, there are 30 volumes of 30 great big fat volumes, folio size, of various literary publications, 45 volumes of political correspondence. I mean, for him, it definitely was a form of therapy. So that's something the two sovereigns had in common. They didn't have much else in common, I think it's fair to say. So mission accomplished, and congratulations. And of course, I suppose I'm really tempted to stop there, but you don't want me to. Oh, I'm going to need a prompt as to when the end is coming up. So I hit my timer, but it didn't start. Sorry about that. Or I can do it on the clock. That's right. I just want to open up a couple of things. We go back to Arnett, and Arnett's edition. Of course, Arnett, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, maybe one or two of you out there, he was director of the Haushältischen Staatsarchiv, and so he had unfettered access to that fantastic archive through the late decades of the 19th century, and he put them to very good purpose. With one slight reservation, which I'll come to in a moment, he was a pretty good editor. A very good editor, brilliant editor. And it's the correspondence between Maria Theresia and Marie-Antoinette which interests me here. Because I'm not sure, and this is really a question actually to Catriona, whether Marie-Antoinette was aware that in effect Mercy was a spy. I mean, he was spying on her, and he was reporting back to Maria Theresia every month, and indeed more often than that, all the latest gossip, what Marie-Antoinette was doing, all her various sins of omission and commission, which in the 1770s were quite numerous. And so I wonder whether this relationship was affected by the knowledge that that Mercy was reporting back. And on the other side, of course, Maria Theresia is communicating her thoughts to Mercy and also to Marie-Antoinette. And you can find they're online, of course. You can find the letters between mother and daughter, and very interesting they are too. Just one thing I would add to what Kelsey was saying, I think it shows that Maria Theresia intellectually was in a different league from Marie-Antoinette. I mean, there's a much more powerful mind at work there, it seems to me. But there was a flaw in the Arnett edition, which I just want to draw everyone's attention to, and I'm sure Catriona knows about this, and that is that Arnett, as he says rather primly in the introduction or preface, I don't suppose anyone ever reads that he has omitted any passage which is intime, or what that means is anything to do with sex. And in fact, there's a huge amount about sex in Marie-Antoinette's correspondence, and indeed Maria Theresia's. Of course, they're absolutely obsessed with it, because Marie-Antoinette had to produce an heir, preferably a spare or two as well. And so through the original correspondence, which actually has been published now, it was published in 1980. I'll hold it up so you can see. They're only in the German language, edited by a man called Paul Christoph. And he just went back into the archives and put all the dirty bits back in. And they're absolutely fascinating. Marie-Antoinette, on the instructions of her mother, records all her periods, whether they're a couple of days late, a couple of days early. And then in 1777, they don't happen. Fantastic celebration. So you can follow it through that. I'd be quite interested to hear what Catriona thinks about that. Well, getting a bit away, I suppose, from her edition, but not that far. All right, how are we doing? Oh, I better speed up. There's just a couple of slight reservations. You actually draw our attention to the fact that Marie-Antoinette introduced a new regime in her household and cut down on positions. I haven't got the actual text here, although I could easily find it. Well, maybe she did, but I wonder how you would respond to, for example, the information that, which I'm sure you're very much aware of, that in 1784, that was a year after the unbelievably expensive War of American Independence had just ended, Marie-Antoinette goes out and buys Saint-Cloud from the Orléans family for 6 million livres, regarded at the time as a huge sum of money to pay. And set up her own establishment there with servants in her own livery and so on. I find that a bit difficult to square with an economizer, which I don't think she ever was really, at least not towards the end. Right, what was the final bit? I must hurry on, otherwise I shan't get around to Avi at all. Oh yes, this is a point. I'm very interested in the foreign policy of this period, and I've written about it. And working through all those Arlet documents and also documents in the Household for Staatsarchiv, it became pretty clear to me that Maria Theresia and Kaunitz were using Marie-Antoinette very much as their agent in the bedroom at Versailles. And Mercy would come around and tell Marie-Antoinette what to do, what she was to do to get Louis XVI to do what the Austrians wanted him to do, whether it was over the Bavarian Exchange or whether it was over the Scheldt exercise, whether it's the intervention of the Prussians in the United Provinces or whatever. And she did her best, I think it has to be said. And so when the French revolutionaries put her on trial in 1793, in part for treason, I have to say they got that about right. I mean, she was trying to run Austrian foreign policy from Versailles. She failed because Louis XVI was always prepared to hand out big sums of money to the Polignac and all the others hangers-on. But when it came to appointments, when it came to policy, appointments he would also do. But when it came to policy, he was quite robust. Okay, well, anyway, still a great book, and many congratulations. And moving on to Avi, I can say the same thing about this. This is perhaps more at home, more recently with Frederick, having just written a big book about him, and I think this is a terrific thing to have. I mean, who actually is going to go online to the University of Trier's website and work through 30 volumes of each one about 1,000 pages of Frederick? No one is, of course, or hardly anybody apart from me. So to have this elegant translation, and I was about to say well selected. Yeah, well, yes, I have one just teeny reservation there. I mean, about a third of the text is devoted to anti-Machiavel. Oh, well, actually, having read it again in this translation, I enjoyed reading it. But it is actually available already in English translation, edited by Paul Sonino. So I guess there must be something wrong with Paul Sonino's edition, which prompted you to include it in this anthology. And I just wondered, in an ideal world, whether it wouldn't perhaps have been better to use some of that space for two very important documents relating to Frederick's views on politics. And they are the two political testaments of 1753 and 1768. They're particularly important because he did not write them to be published. They were to be kept secret, and indeed they weren't published until the early 20th century because they were thought to be too saucy, especially when it came to religious matters, and it includes some of Frederick's most vituperative statements about Christianity. It's a very fine passage. I almost know it by heart now. An old metaphysical fiction born in the fevered imagination of the Orientals. It spread into Europe where some cretins believed it and some unscrupulous rogues pretended to believe it. You know, it goes on in that line. So I just wondered why the political testaments hadn't popped in. And then finally, I think I'm almost out of time, though I haven't had a prompt yet. I've just got time to say the bit I didn't enjoy much, actually, rather surprisingly, because I'd rather share Frederick's views mustn't go there, was the dialogue between Madame de Pompadour and the Virgin Mary. That's pretty crude stuff, isn't it? I was a bit ashamed on his behalf. And again, I mean, in an ideal world, if I've been doing this, it's easy to say this, isn't it? I hope I'm not being too unpleasant. I would put in at least some extracts from the very long homoerotic poem Palladium, which which is a lot of fun, and I think more revealing. Right, okay, yes, well, Nikki's given me a prompt, so that enables me to wrap it up. If I'd had another hour or two, I would have actually, and this is something which, I've got 2 minutes, so I will say this, both when Maria-Theresa and Marie-Antoinette is corresponding with Merci and so on, they frequently refer to les Allemands. They regard them, she regards herself as an Allemand. And Maria-Theresa says, look, you've got to be nicer to the Germans who come to visit you at Versailles. Merci tells me that you're being beastly to them and you poke fun at them because they're clodhoppers. You mustn't do that. Just be nice. We're all Allemands. Similarly, Frederick is always banging on about national characteristics, not to distress any French, Poles, English, or any other European nationality for that matter, but to offer some of Frederick's epithets. But he had a very clear appreciation of national distinction, a bit caricaturist actually. So I just want to throw that into the pot as a final parting shot, not really a shot, more like a caress. 2 great books. Thanks a lot.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. And those were 2 wonderful and complementary appreciations of these 2 books. And I think between you, you've raised lots and lots of questions. So thank you very much indeed for all the thought that went into those preparations. I'm now going to ask Catriona to speak next. And this is the book which you may have seen. Catriona, as I'm sure you know, is Marshall Foch Professor of French Literature at Oxford. She has wide interest in French literature, but particularly is interested in the 18th century, French 18th century ideas and literature. She has a monograph called Les Rois aussi en mouraient about inoculation, which it's probably being translated as we speak. I mean, it's become more topical than perhaps we ever wanted it to become. And then Catriona's also well known for having edited some important authors in the Pléiade collection, Germaine de Staël and Laclos. Relevant to today, she's also published an anthology and dictionary of Marie-Antoinette in Bouquin series. So that, I don't know, but maybe that was what led you to thinking about these letters when you put that anthology together. And the other thing is, I believe I'm right in saying, you'll correct me if not, that your book has come out in Italian translation in 2020. So that's also very happy. So Catriona.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you to you and to Avi for your invitation, and a huge thank you to Kelsey and Tim for their extremely generous comments. When you're writing a book, or when you're preparing a book, certainly when I'm preparing a book, I actually don't think about who my readers are, but were I to have been thinking about ideal readers, I'm sure I would have had Kelsey and Tim in mind. So I shall try and project whenever I'm writing again and think about them and their generous and thoughtful remarks. So I might start, Nicholas, with where you ended, and the fact that, yes, I did begin work on this edition because a very long time ago, I received a phone call, and this will amuse you. I was outside Les Délices in Geneva, about to work in the library there, and my phone rang, and somebody said to me, Catriona, would you write a book about Marie-Antoinette for Bouquin? And I said, just a minute, please. I'm not sure if I can hear you correctly. There's traffic noise. And I sat down on the little wall outside Les Délices, and this French literary editor said, would you write a Marie-Antoinette volume for Bouquin? And that's how it all started. It all started because the Sofia Coppola film had just been announced, and Bouquin wanted a sort of Marie-Antoinette reader. And that's what the volume is. And you're right to talk about it, Nicholas, because it does partly answer one of Tim's questions. You can sort of see it here. Here's one I prepared earlier, as they say in baking programs. It contains Marie-Antoinette's letters to Maria Theresa. But not the answers. But that was when I started going to the Haushof und Staatsarchiv in Vienna, where, as Tim reminded us, Alfred von Arnett was curator, or he was the director of the archives. And that was where I discovered this sort of folder full of letters from Marie-Antoinette to Merci, which went from tiny, tiny, tiny scraps of paper, not much bigger than, I don't know, sort of large commemorative stamp, to letters written on several pages. And I realized that a whole series of them had never ever been published. And I started wondering about how they worked as a complete corpus, because what I discovered was that Alfred von Arnett and then subsequent editors who'd all done a much less good job than him because they basically copied what he'd done, had cherry-picked the bits which they thought were important or interesting, and therefore neglected all sorts of documents. And I thought it was important to show them all. And whilst I agree with what Tim said, that Marie-Antoinette becomes more interesting through her letters as we move across time, and that in the 1770s, we don't have very many letters and they're very short notes, I think having the whole progression is absolutely remarkable for us, because it's a complete correspondence throughout her adult life, and it's the only case we have of a correspondence with the same individual throughout Marie-Antoinette's adult life. And I think one of the things it shows is that quite unlike Frederick, who, as Avi shows, is somebody who uses writing really as a tool, sort of from the start, as a tool, but also as a way of gaining some form of intellectual sort of luster, which he hankers after, even though he's already all-powerful. Marie-Antoinette dislikes writing initially. She's not been schooled to a particularly high level in intellectual pursuits. She's very good at certain things. She loves music, for instance, and is a very good musician, but she doesn't particularly like writing. Reading isn't one of her chief pursuits or occupations. And so she uses writing when it's necessary, and it's rarely necessary for her in the early part of her life, but it is necessary if she wants to summon the ambassador to get him to do something, or if she has to accept, for instance, she needs to organize a reception for a visiting Austrian member of the nobility or general or whoever. And when she writes those letters, they're very quick notes, which are to be handed to the ambassador. I think there is then a consciousness that you can use the notes to communicate outside official circuits, and Marie-Antoinette very much uses her little notes to the ambassador if she has something she wants to tell him without it being apparent that she's communicating with him. And that when I said that some of the notes are the size of large postage stamps, sometimes it's because they're there to be handed over secretly. Marie-Antoinette can hand them to, for instance, a servant, and the servant can then, you know, rush across from Versailles to Paris and drop off the note to Merci. These forms of secrecy are important because Marie-Antoinette is sometimes giving away secret information. So she's telling Merci things which she thinks might be useful for the Empress and subsequently for the Emperor. So for instance, revealing who's in line to become the next ambassador to Berlin. That's one of the questions which arises, and which is obviously of great importance for Frederick too. And Marie-Antoinette is doing this because the ambassador is acting as a lobbyist for her mother and then her brothers, and is putting pressure on her. And I think it's an interesting correspondence because it shows that although Marie-Antoinette is actually, firstly, you know, an Archduchess of Austria and then becomes Queen of France, in many ways, in the relationship between her and Merci, Merci is the dominant character. Merci is the one who is bullying her to a large extent and trying to make her act in Austria's interests at all times. And Marie-Antoinette is quite happy to do so when she can, but not when this enters into a collision course with French interests. And there are extraordinary letters between Merci and Chancellor Kaunitz, in which Merci and Kaunitz plainly show that they do not understand that Marie-Antoinette is between two possible homelands, her birth country and the country into which she married, and that there is no way that she can legitimately do anything against France simply to favor Austria. And someone like Merci believes that, you know, the only thing you can do is support Austria. And he thinks that she's being almost a traitor to the cause by not supporting Austria. And I'd like to pick up, I think, a very useful term which Kelsey suggested regarding Marie-Antoinette's letters in this latter part of her life when she's in Paris. The royal family is taken in October 1789 to Paris, where they're installed at the Tuileries. There is some appearance of court life resuming, but they are de facto under a sort of house arrest. They're certainly under surveillance first and then under a form of house arrest. And Kelsey referred to letter writing becoming Marie-Antoinette's lifeline. And I thought that was a really apt comment. Because of where she ends up, because she's under surveillance, Marie-Antoinette wants to correspond with, for instance, her brother, the emperor, but with various other people. Merci, at that stage, is sent to pacify the Austrian Netherlands, which are in turmoil, so he's in Brussels. And Marie-Antoinette is writing to him, asking him to intervene to get the foreign powers to help the French king consolidate his position on the throne. So she's very much working for the idea of France as she understands it and hoping to use merci in order to get to achieve this this aim. So she's becoming someone politically much more astute than she was. She was very naive, I think, and it's really from about 1788 onwards that you really see her taking an active interest in politics. During the revolution, the king is in a state of semi-depression. The Dauphin dies in July 1789, and from then on, it seems Louis XVI is somewhat depressed, and he's particularly depressed also because his public attitude is contradicted by his private beliefs in many ways. He has to toe an apparent party line and is not free to act as he would like to. So Marie-Antoinette becomes very much the underhand political member of the couple, of the royal couple. So she acquires a form of agency, and she acquires it through her letter writing and through this political correspondence, which one would not have expected at all at the beginning of her life. And she uses merci very much because when she left for France as a teenager, she was told to put her trust in merci. She does so. She refers when Joseph II has died and their brother Leopold becomes the next king of Hungary and then emperor. She says to him, you can put all your trust in Ambassador Merci. He's like a father to me. And she never realizes to what extent, as Tim pointed out, Merci is in fact a spy and a bully. And she, I think, is a much more honest person in the relationship, I think. And that is one of the reasons why, and I will end on this point in order not to go on for too long. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to present Marie-Antoinette's letters on their own rather than surrounded by the other related letters. I refer to them sometimes in what Tim referred to as the sort of mini essays which introduced the letters in order to give them context. But I felt it was important to listen to Marie-Antoinette's voice, to hear what she had to say for herself, because paradoxically, I think she is one of the most famous characters in French history, certainly the most famous queen, but potentially one of the most famous characters in French history. And yet she's also the one about whom there is more mythologizing than anyone else. And one of the only ways I thought in which one could try and get to the real Marie-Antoinette, as it were, was by listening to her voice and listening to her voice by reading her texts, reading the texts which we knew were authentic rather than either what other people had been writing about her during her lifetime and beyond, or indeed the false letters to which Kelsey referred and which I included at the end, just in a sense, to show what was out there, and what people had been propagating, not so much because they betray her, they don't, but just because I thought it was important for us to have only the authentic texts. But that's, I think, where I will end. I hope that I've answered the questions. Once again, I was extremely happy to listen to Kelsey and Tim's feedback, and delighted also to read Frederick the Great, including, I have to say, the dialogue with Pompadour. So I'm not complaining about it having been included. It's another bit of France in Frederick the Great's centers of interest. And like Marie-Antoinette, though born in a German-speaking land, he was very much a French speaker by choice for most of his life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Before we open up to questions, I'm now going to ask Avi to also comment on the discussants. So Avi's book, as we've already mentioned, is very beautifully translated by Angela Scholar, who is an experienced translator from French. Avi, apart from being my colleague who's running the Enlightenment seminar, but today he's changed hats. He's a fellow in history at Magdalen College in Oxford, and before that he taught at UCL. He works on the intellectual and cultural history of Europe in the long 18th century, particularly on the links between Enlightenment anthropology, theology, and political theory. He's published with the OUP Language and Enlightenment, the Berlin Debates of the 18th Century. He's also published a very interesting series of edited volumes, one on Epicurus published by the Voltaire Foundation, one on Lessing published by OUP, one on Rousseau published by the CUP. He's published many articles. I'll mention only the one that won a prize recently, The Book of Job and the Sex Life of Elephants. If there was a prize for eye-watering illustrations, it would have won that too. And what we're looking at here, I believe that you're currently working on a monograph exploring the Prussian monarch's activities as a philosopher and as a public author. So I think in some ways, is it right that this collection of Frederick's writings in some ways is a sort of first step towards that bigger project that you're currently working on? This is the first modern edition in English of Frederick's writings, and it came out with Princeton at the end of last year. Over to you, Avi.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Nicholas, for this kind introduction. And yes, I think around 19 and 20, 2019, 2020, yeah, I went on from theological discussions of the sex life of elephants to Frederick and being the first servant of the state. I tried, some people asked me why, what's the connection? And actually, there is no connection. I tried to comb Frederick's writings for any reference to elephants, but unfortunately, I didn't find any. So yes, you're right. I received recently a Levi-Hume research grant to work on a short, I hope, short monograph on Frederick the Great's philosophical writings, or his persona as a philosopher or as a writer, and to take it seriously. And initially I hadn't really intended to do that, but working on this edition, I got to the idea that, I mean, there is much more to do on Frederick as a philosopher. First of all, before delving into the circumstances and answering Kelsey's first question of how we got to work on these editions at all, because these days, unfortunately, I think in modern day academia, editing such editions do not really give you the credit that other publications usually tend to give you. So before doing that, I would like to thank Tim and Kelsey for wonderful comments. And again, as Catriona said, I mean, hearing you discuss our work make us aware, or make us of sort of aspects of our work that we were not really thinking of. So this was really a wonderful set of comments on our editions. And also, I would like to thank wholeheartedly Angela Scholar, the translator of the edition, for her meticulous and really excellent work on this edition. So thank you very much, Angela. I think she might be in the audience tonight. So I actually got to work on this edition because of teaching. So it's less interesting or cinematic than Catriona's, let's say, sudden phone call in Switzerland. It's actually much more mundane. I was teaching my Enlightenment and Revolution course at UCL for several years, and actually saying something that is almost a cliche, or describing how the self-presentation of absolutist rulers changed throughout the 18th century, from Louis XIV, who allegedly says, "I am the state," or "the state is me, l'état c'est moi." Of course, we don't have any record of him actually saying that, to Frederick the Great saying some 50 years later, "I am the first servant of the state." And of course, how this basically represents the differentiation between the ruler and his estate or state, and the rise of the modern concept of an impersonalized state that is really separated from the person of the king. And then I had a few students throughout the years asking me like where they can find some material to work on it for essays. And unfortunately, most of these essays were not available in English, apart from partial 18th century translations. And then I thought, okay, we might have a new modern English edition of these works. So this was how the idea came to life. Then it took a very long time to get the funding for the translation, for professional translation by someone like Angelo Scolar with so much experience of translating 18th century French into modern English. And I'm very grateful to the relatively new research center Sanssouci of the University of Potsdam and the Stiftung Preußische Schlösser und Gärten, because they actually provided the funding for the translation. Okay, to answer first perhaps Tim Blanning's point about why the anti-Machiavel is there, whereas there is a modern edition of this work. Indeed, there is a translation by Paul Sonino. I think it's University of Oklahoma Press, or one of the American university presses in the late 1970s. It's only the anti-Machiavel, and it's already out of print. Actually, I would agree with Tim. I mean, I didn't really want to include the anti-Machiavel there. First, because it's out of sync with the mature Frederick, right? I mean, it really reflects Frederick as a crown prince. It's much more, let's say, idealistic than other works than he writes later. It's not very clear how much of that is Frederick and how much of that is Voltaire, although of course they thought along the same lines. And the Anti-Machiavel itself appears in the Voltaire Foundation's complete works of Voltaire. And I think rightly so, it's a joint work of Frederick and Voltaire. But of course, my editor at Princeton University Press and the press itself were adamant that because this is, or this has become the most famous work by Frederick, readers, especially the broader audience I was aiming at, for example, undergraduate members of the educated public, or what the Germans call Feuilletonleser, they would expect it to be in any sort of edition of a broad range of works by Frederick the Great. And its length is another problem. Yes, I mean, that was another reason why I thought maybe it shouldn't be there. Maybe just extracts from the Anti-Machiavel should be included, because it is quite long and it occupies, roughly a third of the edition. The selection was not easy, of course. As Tim says, there are very many other works that could have been included. from theatrical plays like Le Singe à la Mode, to the late work, Letters on the Love of the Fatherland, and many other dialogues of the dead, not only between Madame de Pompadour and the Virgin Mary, but many others. Letters, of course, Kelsey refers to that. And initially I did intend to include a letter there, a letter to d'Alembert from the 1770s. But after it had already been translated, it seemed a bit too enmeshed in the correspondence, in the flow of correspondence, in the context of previous letters to, let's say, hold its place as a self-standing contribution to this edition. However, as I told Nicholas just a few days ago, if this edition ends up selling anything or selling decently, I think there is enough material in Frederick's works for at least some 3-4 sequels with wonderful selections. Of course, the Palladion, the work that Tim mentioned, would be a wonderful item to include, although it's quite a long picaresque epos, but at least some, let's say, choice bits from it would be great. And as to the political testaments that Tim suggests including, that would be a very good idea, but I'm not sure they are on the same level of the other political or philosophical works that he actually intended for consumption, either by the public or by his confidants or by his correspondents. Because one of the guiding principles here of this edition was the importance of looking at contemporary and subsequent reception. So how contemporaries used works by Frederick, how they were received by contemporaries. And that's, for me, a way to go beyond the usual, let's say, historical way of dealing with Frederick's writings, which is to say, oh, that's just a means of self-fashioning in the public sphere. Frederick wants to show off. Frederick wants to use them for particular political, short-term political purposes. And therefore, the actual nitty-gritty of what he writes, the contents, does not really matter. So, you know, he endorses the social contract, but, you know, what sort of social contract? You know, he could have endorsed the social contract in 5, 6 conflicting ways. But so, you know, for me, it's interesting to see not only the way that his contemporaries sometimes used his works against him and not in the way that he himself intended. So it goes beyond the question of whether he was sincere at the time of writing, but also to ask about the intellectual strands that molded the philosophical writings. What did he read? What did he want to take on board? Which ideas that he discussed in Voltaire find their ways into the philosophical works that then he publishes or sends to his confidants? A question that Kelsey raised is very interesting. She asked about Frederick's skepticism, or about his attitude to truth, which is apparent, I think, from the very beginning of this volume in his dissertation on the innocence of error of the mind. I think that's how it's called in this English edition. And I think this dissertation, which is again a reply to Voltaire's work on the philosophy of Newton, Frederick endorses wholeheartedly what we scholars of the Enlightenment call the Enlightenment's epistemic humility, or this attitude of Enlightenment authors where they oppose dogmatism, religious or otherwise, and also their aversion to system building in metaphysics or any other area. And I think that's something that accompanies Frederick all through his life. And this is why I would abstain, for example, from saying Frederick is an Epicurean thinker and a Stoic thinker or Neo-Stoic thinker, as Gerhard Oesterreich, for example, describes him, or that Frederick is a Lockean thinker, because Frederick himself really concocts a very interesting synthesis from many different ingredients based on this very conviction of epistemic humility. You know, we should approach different philosophical systems with an eclectic mind, with an open mind, and never go down the path of dogmatic philosophical, let's say, school building. And I think Tim raised the question of national characteristics and, you know, the Frenchness or let's say the Germanness of Frederick. And I think here another essay that I would definitely include in a volume 2 if I had to edit one is Frederick's essay on German literature, which I discuss briefly in the introduction. Because this is not really an essay on German literature as much as it is an essay against German literature. And it's quite remarkable because it's quite a late essay, 1784. You know, the Lessing is on the scene, the young Goethe is already on the scene, Herder, many of the founding fathers of German literature, and Frederick is just not interested in them. He doesn't really read them seriously, he doesn't take them seriously, he doesn't engage with them. For him, philosophy is not really done in German. Of course, the young Kant, the young Immanuel Kant is on the scene, Moses Mendelssohn had already been writing for 30-something years. There's zero engagement with the German scene in this essay on German literature. And what's interesting, though, is for Frederick, by writing in French, he tries to engage with a very broad public sphere. And this, I think, reflects his attitudes to debate in the public sphere in general. He wants to build up dialogues, as Kelsey rightly said. He basically reviews and sometimes refutes works by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, works by Baron d'Holbach, engages with D'Alembert, engages with Voltaire, with you know, almost anyone and everyone who's writing in France, and is also quite relaxed about debate in the Prussian public sphere, as long as it is about philosophy and, let's say, journalistic, philosophical debate in the open. Of course, criticism of religion is all over the place, not only in the dialogue between Madame de Pompadour and Virgin Mary, which is a bit radical and, let's say, even, you know, quite let's say flat. I would take Tim Blanning's critique and agree with it here, but also, of course, in his preface to the Ecclesiastical History by Fleury, which is included in this edition, in the Princeton edition, and this is basically a presentation of Christianity as one tissue of lies, charades, and quarrels, and basically the history of Christianity as bad faith from antiquity to the present. So, and of course, the epistle to Keith, where he talks about cowardly Christians, go on and do your, or abstain from only because you believe in the hocus pocus of some rewards and punishments in another world, and so on. So, I mean, I think on religion, Frederick was absolutely, of course, open to criticism, but on many other on many other areas and issues as well. And the essay on German literature proves that, because it was the subject of, I think, almost universal condemnation and criticism in Prussia, including by Frederick's own civil servants. So I think I should bring this comment to an end here. And yeah, I think as Tim said, if we had another hour or two to discuss Frederick's output, of course, we could have done so. So thank you very much to Tim and Kelsey for your wonderful comments, and to Catriona for the wonderful dialogue between your edition of Marie-Antoinette's Letters and my edition of Frederick's philosophical works. Thank you.
Avi, thank you very much indeed. Well, I think there's probably general agreement that we could have there's easily room for a second volume. So we hope Princeton Press are listening in. If not, we'll write to them afterwards or send them the video. These have been two wonderful portraits of, on the one hand, a queen who isn't really a writer, or she's a reluctant writer. She writes, as Catriona said, when she has to, and the more urgent and pressing things get, the better she gets at it. But she writes out of necessity, really. And Frederick, who, as you show, actually fashions himself as a writer as part of his notion of kingship. And of course, I find that very fascinating because as a Voltaire scholar, I'm used to the French colleagues looking at the relationship between Voltaire and Frederick from the French angle. The French colleagues don't normally like to point out that the correspondence between Voltaire and Frederick begins with Frederick. It's Frederick takes the first initiative, of course. And all those notions of how the writer positions himself, herself in the literary field, actually Voltaire has exactly those questions as well. So in some ways, I think Voltaire and Frederick have a dialogue at that level too, about what it means to be an author. But I'm going to, I've got a question that came in very early, so I'm going to start with that from Thomas Noriega, which I shall read to you. To what degree did these monarchs acknowledge the potential biases that their supreme political power would have on their political philosophies? For example, was Frederick, insofar as he was a prince, actively self-conscious that a prince could be advised towards wickedness and violence in his anti-Machiavel? Or did he consider himself an impartial, perhaps even elevated and objective commentator on the text and its political implications? Is that okay, Avi? It's a slightly complicated, it's a long question, but I can read it again if it...
Well, I think, my answer would be quite short. Building on what I've just said in response to Kelsey, I think Frederick would not really claim or have any claim for objectivity. He would absolutely agree that he is not objective, that he represents his own views. His attack on Machiavelli is quite vicious, unfair at times. Sometimes he doesn't really bother to read him properly. And yes, he would say, yeah, this is my, epistemic stance. Others would have theirs, and he would be willing to engage in, a kind of conversation, refutation, reviews, and so on, as really in dialogue, as he does throughout his philosophical writings, throughout his career.
I thought the point you made too, that it's the work of a crown prince when he's still talking with Voltaire, that surely must be crucial, rather than it's not the work of the king. He's more interested in the theories of certain kingship than he's playing with the ideas more than he will later, maybe. Mm-hmm. I've got another question from Kevin Hilliard. Hello, Kevin. If Frederick is neither an Epicurean nor a Stoic, and so forth, could he be aligned with the programmatic eclecticism of a number of German philosophers of the early Enlightenment, like Brucker? Or is there an equivalent French school? Or is the eclecticism you described homegrown?
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for this question. I would opt for the latter option. I do think it's quite sui generis in Frederick's case. He really goes through ancient philosophy and makes his own choices. So that's why I believe it's very difficult, for example, to identify him as adhering to any sort of early modern neo-Stoicism or some sort of Christianized Epicureanism a la Gassendi or so on. I think you raise a very interesting point, because to some extent, his eclecticism makes him very similar to those early German, early Enlightenment German philosophers like Brucker. The problem is, I think, that he was not interested so much in the early German Enlightenment scholars. Sometimes he likes referring to them by name, like Thomasius or Leibniz, of course. Leibniz, it's mostly because, of course, of Frederick's engagement with Wolff, but in both cases, mostly with French works by Leibniz or with French translations of Christian Wolff's works. So yeah, to some extent, Frederick ends up adopting the same meta-philosophical stance towards philosophical schools, but I'm not sure he actually builds on the work of German university professors. I mean, he had a very critical stance on university professors, whom he time and again just describes as pedants or even ponderous pedants, and just boring writers. So I'm not sure they would be his intellectual examples in this sense.
Thank you. Can I just say, if Tim or Kelsey would like to butt in, please just wave and do just come into the conversation. I've got a question I'd like to ask Catriona actually about the confidentiality of Marie-Antoinette's letters. So you said at one point that they were very often secret, and I like very much the idea that some of these letters are very tiny. So you say in your introduction, you talk about, at one point you say lettres et billets, or billets et lettres. So presumably the billets, normally speaking, the tiny ones, the letters are rhetorically more a performance. Does it, I mean, obviously a billet is normally very private, and is delivered by a servant, for example. Do we know whether the letters were sometimes read by, well, I mean, we know that Merci is reporting back to Vienna, but do we know if the letters themselves were copied or sent back, or to what extent were they put in the public realm?
Thank you, that's a great question. And yes, the billets are very short, they are unsigned, but all of Marie-Antoinette's correspondence with Merci is unsigned. That's not unusual for those of us who work on the 18th century, where personal letters are very rarely signed, unless there's a sort of performance element to them. Are they public or not? They're not public, but they are sometimes communicated to others. And you're quite right to talk about Vienna, the fact that before the revolution already, when Merci is spying on Marie-Antoinette and reporting back to Maria Theresa or to Kaunitz, for instance, he will copy out letters, he will send letters, he will send notes and say, look at what she wrote, or, you know, this is what she said in a recent message, etc. So to that extent, even before the revolution, there's a form of circulation. During the revolution, things become much more complicated. I mentioned that the royal family at that stage is under sort of certainly surveillance and semi-house arrest. And so the correspondence with foreigners is banned very, very rapidly during the revolution, particularly with anyone who's a representative of a foreign power, which might be considered as an enemy, which means that these letters have to be smuggled out. So it's no longer simply smuggling a little note out and trying to avoid you know, a courtier seeing it being smuggled out from Versailles. It's really about not letting the revolutionaries know that you're corresponding with a foreign power. And so there are all sorts of tricks. One of the things which they do, of course, is make sure they know who's delivering what and to whom. And so the royal family will recruit a whole series of agents, so people who happen to be traveling for their own affairs. So for instance, the Spanish ambassador travels for his own affairs, and he often serves as an intermediary if Marie-Antoinette has anything to be transported anywhere. And then there are a whole series of other people who are loyal to the royal family for one reason or another. Quite often they don't know what they're transporting, they're just asked if they could drop off a letter. And sometimes they don't even know they're dropping off a letter because the letter is transformed into something else. So the letter is hidden, for instance, in the lining of a hat box or something like that. So they're asked to drop off a hat, and they don't realize that what they're really dropping off is a secret message about whether or not there are troops on the border, and so on. And to add to the cloak and dagger aspect of things, during the revolution, a lot of the letters are written in code. And it is said, and this is probably the only time that we might have some form of proximity between the books Frederick might have had on his pile to read, and Marie-Antoinette might also have had on her bedside table. It is said that Montesquieu's Considérations were one of the volumes used for code words. So that would something where we might have both monarchs together. So yes, there's a lot of, they use that, they use invisible ink and so on, all in an attempt not to be discovered.
Yes, I'm used to the phenomenon of working on 18th century letters and looking for envelopes. I've never had to look for a hat box. That was really quite special. I love the idea of a hat box. I'd ask Kelsey a question, if I may, which is how, I mean, I know you're working on Catherine and intellectual biography. I mean, Catherine too publishes a lot, doesn't she? Not just the letters that you've translated with Andrew, but Catherine writes plays, she writes journals, I think. So is she like Frederick in wanting to sort of using publication as a way of positioning herself in her realm?
Absolutely. I think both Frederick and Catherine are very sensitive, as I said in my presentation, to audience. And so I think in Avi's volume, you get a real sense of, again, the different publics that Frederick is talking to. So you have, things that are for Voltaire or for the small circle of intimates, that are maybe printed for them, and then, that get out, escape. And then you have the things that are intended for, Frederick says, if you're publishing something, you're publishing for the whole universe, right? So he's really going for everybody. And Catherine also has, her different layers of publicity that she's going for. I think there is a distinction in terms of who the readers can be in the respective countries. So again, if you're talking about Russia, there's a very, very small reading public within Russia, primarily nobles. And I think if you're talking about Prussia, you have a bit of a broader sphere of print that you can be addressing within, the monarch can be addressing within their own country. But then Catherine is also, she gets actually in her later years more active in publishing things more with sort of transparent anonymity in Prussia in particular. And because she sees that is a place where you have this public sphere it's really important to be participating in print. And so that's to Frederick's credit as well to have created that. And then Catherine sees that and says, I want to participate in that too. Absolutely. So
do you think Catherine is partly, I mean, this is a huge question, but is Catherine partly influenced by the model of Frederick?
That is a huge question. Yes, there's competition. It's a very, very complicated relationship between the two of them. She owes her position in part to Frederick's intervention when she's young, and then she's definitely looking at his model. She's very, very she disagrees very strongly with his position on German literature. She's very interested in German literature in her later years. And she's a reader of Frederick's, of these works that she gets in when his posthumous works come out. She gets them and she claims to have stopped reading on page 17 because he says such nasty things about Russia. But I think it's clear that she read rather more than that.
There's a question from Andrew Kahn on this point about monarchs and audience. It's interesting to note that Derek Beals, in his chapter in the Cambridge History of Political Thought, calls Catherine the preeminent philosophe ruler, not because of her writing, but because of her reading. This seemed to me a surprising definition of the philosophe or the philosopher king or queen as reader, but not pragmatic intellectual. Do you have any thoughts about that? I think that's addressed to Avi as well as Kelsey.
This is a very interesting point. Because as I said, I mean, I'm quite surprised by the extent to which Frederick engaged with whatever has been written throughout his lifetime. I mean, there is a tendency among some historians, for example, to say, oh, Frederick is just a relic of late 17th century intellectual culture. It's all about La Rochefoucauld. It's all about the early Voltaire. He doesn't really evolve with the time. But even in the second half of his reign, when he becomes, let's say, more cantankerous and so on, he keeps reading everything. He keeps publishing, writing, refuting contributing, reviewing, and so on, and writing in those multiple genres again, which is another fascinating feature of his intellectual work. So yeah, I think for him reading is definitely an important pastime. I think there is a very interesting letter from the time when he was engaged in the negotiations for the Peace of Hubertusburg, right? I mean, putting an end to the 7 Years' War that raged all over Europe, and of course where Prussia was almost close to annihilation in some points of the war. And what he has to report to the Duchess, who is correspondent, is it's really kind of a long review of Rousseau's Emile that was published in 1762. And he says, you know, book 1 is so and so, and book 2 is also quite good. The later books really lost me, and so on. So again, it's quite remarkable that he had the time and he had the wish to engage with almost everything that, engage seriously with almost everything that was published, mostly in France. Another point about audiences that I don't know if Kelsey and Catriona and Tim would like to comment on, which I find very, very puzzling in Frederick's career, is that sometimes he has to deal with responses among unintended audiences. For example, he writes his philosophical poems for the small circle of confidants, and he publishes it only in 20-something copies, only for those confidants. He really doesn't want it to be printed for public consumption. Then the French government actually happens to print it, to put its hand on it and to print it widely during the 7 Years' War, partly as a means of propaganda against Frederick, because it presents him as a non-religious, anti-religious, quite scurrilous writer. And he finds it very difficult initially to deal with such cases where he seems to write only to D'Alembert and Voltaire, and then he has to deal with a completely different set of readers and responses. I mean, later on he comes to terms with that, and he actually sort of presents himself as quite relaxed about all sorts of criticism from different audiences. But I wonder if that happens ever to Marie-Antoinette, that her letters, for example, are read by people who are not supposed to be the recipients, or beyond the small circle in Vienna, and or the ambassadors who are meant to be the readers, or to Catherine as well.
So I can answer for Marie-Antoinette, not as far as I know. I think it's partly because Marie-Antoinette is a reluctant letter writer anyhow, that she's not writing much. And when she does write, it tends to go via couriers or, you know, sort of private individuals, rather than any way in which things can be seized. So it really is very much the Austrian side, her mother's government and her brother's ministers, etc., then who are doing more about it. What's, I think, clear is that there are things said which Marie-Antoinette is said to have said or said to have written, which are not necessarily true. So there's a lot of circulation of things which are not necessarily by her, but are attributed to her, more than really of her authentic letters. But Tim wanted to come in.
Tim, I think, had a question.
Yes, there is actually quite a bit about this in the Paul Christoph edition, the German edition, and I mean it's just Frank's what Catriona's just been saying, and that is these letters were very carefully controlled. Maria Theresia was extremely careful as to who should see what, and it's really the letters when they arrive in Vienna, they only go through one or maybe two hands and no more. Had to be couriers, no question of consigning anything to the post, because that was certain to be intercepted. No, I mean they keep a very tight control of this, and I don't think that it. Of course, it didn't mean that there couldn't be forgeries, but the actual bona fide letters, I think, were kept under very strict control at the time.
And I think to add to what Tim has just said, in particular, Maria Theresia is a complete control freak in many ways, but for anything which touches on her children, it's, you know, doubled or trebled or quadrupled. And for instance, she doesn't want her children corresponding with each other without this going through Vienna. Vienna has to be the pivot for absolutely everything. She wants to be, she's this sort of all-seeing eye at the center. And so someone like Merci is just a very good dog for her. You know, he's doing her job, he's being her eyes, and he is sometimes being her voice. But she very much is a sort of panopticon, the way she certainly views her relationship with her children overseas. I think Kelsey wanted to come in.
Yes, if I might answer both Andrew's question and Avi's. In terms of reading, I think there are two different sides to the question of why reading is so important to the notion of an Enlightenment monarch. So on the one hand, there's the old view, right, that these Enlightenment monarchs are supposed to just implement whatever they've read in the writings of philosophers and so forth, and that's the sort of crucial part of the definition of what we're talking about there. But, you know, for example, Catherine is extremely clear that that's not what she's doing, that she intends to choose what she wants from what she's read from her very extensive reading and process it and decide for herself what it is that Russia needs in terms of becoming modernized, enlightened, Western, all of those things. But also, absolutely, I think it's a really important point that is made that, you know, Catherine, if one's thinking about, say, an intellectual biography of Catherine, really what one will need to do is to sit down and read the incredible amount of material that she took in. And it's definitely not really what we think of. She reads the classics of literature at that time, but she's reading an incredible amount of, you know, the press, all of these things that we don't normally think about. So it will involve really immersing yourself in a sort of different reading world to understand her thinking. And in terms of audience, absolutely, it happens to Catherine very much that her letters are read in ways that she doesn't intend. And I could come up with lots and lots of examples, but I guess the ones that are most relevant here would be her sort of first letter to a philosophe, to d'Alembert, goes, I guess we'd say goes viral, and gets, you know, it's printed in England, and, you know, almost immediately it's printed all over. And she sort of says, oh, wait a minute, I don't think I meant quite that level of publicity. She wants people to know about it, but her text sort of gets out of control. And so after that first instance, she's very careful to always set the terms in each of her correspondences. Okay, this is who, you know, you can share it with a certain number of people, or it's always very clear that way. But it keeps haunting her even during the revolution. One of her letters to the Prince de Ligne gets published, and one of the royalist newspapers ends up publishing a sort of reputation saying, you know, that letter can't possibly be by the Empress. She's still in her right mind. And so that's the sort of management of the audience is always very important.
There was a wonderful set of lectures at the British Library a few years back on 18th century Queen's libraries in Europe. So, for example, looking at Queen Caroline, the consort of George II, she had a great library. So I don't think she's particularly, well, she writes letters, but she was a scholar and quite intellectual, and did put in St. James's Palace, constituted quite an important library. So there's another whole side to it. Before we finish, I've got a question for Catriona from June Watson. So this is for Catriona. The Duchess of Devonshire visited Marie-Antoinette during the Revolution and looked after the interests of many émigrés. Have you found any letters between the two women?
Alas, no, I haven't looked at them, but I haven't found any either. The Duchess of Devonshire is an absolutely fascinating character too, and the whole émigré milieu in London is one which has been worked on to a certain extent, but there's still a lot more to do, I think. So a great research object there. I didn't set out to look for Marie-Antoinette's letters. I have come across a whole load which are not in the large volume to which Kelsey referred earlier on, Evelyn Lever's volume, which was supposedly the complete letters of Marie-Antoinette. But I'm always on the lookout for more. So watch this space, and I will watch the Duchess of Devonshire space too. If you come up with any, that would be absolutely great. And certainly, I think is a good way of showing that research is a never-ending pursuit. So thank you for bringing that sort of missing link to our attention.
Thanks, Catriona. I think a bit reluctantly, I think I do have to stop because talks like these events to finish more or less within 90 minutes. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank very much Catriona and Avi and congratulate them on 2 fantastic books. And I really want to thank Tim and Kelsey for their work in stimulating and generating such a good discussion. I think when I did history at school, I remember we did the 18th century and we studied enlightened despots, and there was a very standard line. I don't think women came, it was mainly men as far as I remember, but there was a very standard view about how this was done. And I think by looking at monarchs' writing, in this way, it completely changes some of those traditional ways of approaching this material. I think it's absolutely fascinating, actually. And to bring together historians and literary critics together around these texts could be incredibly rich, I think, as we discover more letters. I think with some reluctance, I've got to stop. In 2 weeks today, we have the final session for this term, and we're going to look at a Voltaire edition. We're going to look at the brand new edition of Voltaire's Précis du siècle Louis XV. This is Voltaire's history of his own century, the first ever edition, and we'll be discussing that. So please join us then for that. Meantime, thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you in a fortnight. So I'll say good night. Bye-bye now.
Thank you very much.